Nothing yet. Yeah. We still got 2 minutes. Okay, so we have here Larry Conn and Bill Clute. And on the other side, we have Matt McAllister and Virge of a single name.
Like Socrates.
Right. Like Socrates and Plato and all the greats. Yes. Again, thank you for coming out. Bill and Larry formed a little group called Christian Thinkers, Apologetics, and Truth Seekers. So it's a rather open group. They kind of wanted to have atheists show up, so we more than happily obliged. The other thing that I do have to emphasize is Piedmont Humanists. We are a humanist group, not an atheist group. This debate will make it seem like it is, but there's just a huge overlap between humanism and atheism. Since atheism is what I don't believe, so it's a negative. It's kind of like I don't like sports. You know, and so what do? You get a bunch of people who don't like sports together meeting every whether they do. Many people think, what's the point of atheist meeting? You're just going to beat up on Christians? I don't know why. Humanism is a positive. It is a thing. It is the best way that I have to explain it is assume if there is no God, there is no spiritual cosmic guidance out there. What does that mean? It means a lot of things, but one of the things it means is it's just us. We've got to make this work. So we've got to get along, we've got to take care of this planet. And you can read the 21 affirmations of humanism. Just look up humanism on the web, you'll find all kinds of good stuff about it. But it is a positive belief of what we need to be doing. And this is the humanist group. It just turns out when atheists realize if they converted away from something, they realize, okay, now what? Humanism is usually what they find. So, who wants to get started? Oh, okay, rules. Matt, you want to give us the rules?
I think Bill laid it.
Oh, okay.
Maybe we agree on it.
Can you hear me? Yeah. The rules are each side will get 15 minutes of an opening statement, and then we will have 10-minute rebuttals for both sides, 5-minute closings, and then we'll open it up to Q&A with you all. Thomas will moderate that, and on those Q&As, the side that is being questioned will get 2 minutes to respond. The other side will get 1 minute to respond if they care to.
And the minutes are hard stops.
Yeah, we're gonna. When your time's up, your time's up.
And did we agree who was going to go first?
Affirmative.
Affirmative goes first. So, who's affirmative? Okay. All right. Take it away.
Down.
Yes. Oh, PowerPoint. Okay. And I'll turn this for
Best team.
Make sure you're steering.
This is a test. Can you guys hear me okay if I stand? Yeah. Is that good back there?
We're good.
Okay. Let's think about it.
Whose time are you?
I got
I'm timing. Okay, you got time?
Well,
Okay.
that's for my own sake. You want to keep it official. That's
I'll do
fine.
the official.
All right.
Do we turn the lights down? So
Yes. Can we do that?
Alex,
white
go.
on white. Lights?
Lights.
Yeah, better. Wish I had chosen black letters at this point. Okay. All right, count. You ready?
Okay.
All right. Thanks, everyone, seriously, for having me. I consider it an honor to be here, and I consider many of you friends. I hope at the end of this debate I have more friends and not fewer. But what I do want to show today is that there are theists out there, people that really believe in God, that take science, philosophy, logic, rationality very seriously. We do our best to follow the evidence wherever it leads. I'm going to be defending the position that belief in God is actually more reasonable than non-belief in God. To do this, I am not going to ask you to believe anything on faith. I'm not going to point to a Bible or any other so-called holy book. What I'm going to do is show, using our very best scientific theories, our most solidly held philosophy, and the common intuitions that you guys all have to show that belief in God is actually the much more rational position and the more reasonable position. Okay. We're not picking that up at all. Sorry, thanks. Okay. Is this better? Put it on there.
Okay. Now my loud voice is a little
Now we
loud.
can definitely hear you.
Okay.
Thanks, Larry.
I'll resume this
All right,
back. Okay. Resume. All right, let's start with science. Let's go back to the beginning of the universe. It used to be held that the universe was eternal. That was kind of the main position. But as science got better, we discovered the universe is actually expanding. And not only expanding, it's increasing in its rate of expansion. From this, we're able to determine, by taking that back, that the universe actually came into existence 13.7 billion years ago, approximately, in an event we commonly call the Big Bang. Now, the Big Bang actually got even more bolstered as a theory recently when they discovered some cosmic radiation background that would have happened if the Big Bang were true. In 2003, three physicists, Arvin Bohr, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, none of these people are theists, were able to show that any universe that has been, on average, in a cosmic state of expansion cannot be past eternal, but must be finite in the past. And what's amazing about their theorem is that it holds regardless of our early description of the physical universe. We don't yet have a quantum theory of gravity, but regardless of what we discover about that quantum theory, their theorem will show that the universe did have a finite past in the beginning. Let me quote Mr. Vilenkin here, who's kind of the main spokesman for this. And he says, "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." So I'm going to start premise one of my first argument: the universe began to exist. Now that's pretty uncontroversial. Our best science and physicists say that the universe began to exist. But what brought the universe into being? Some people think it just kind of came into existence out of nothing. But this flies in the face of our most deeply held philosophical conviction that we base science on, which is namely, out of nothing, nothing comes. Let me quote a great skeptic, David Hume. Referring to this law of causality, he said, "I never asserted so absurd a proposition that something could arise without a cause." So what are our options for causes? Well, let's let all the possibilities on the table, everything that could be a possibility. Let's leave nothing out. Since at the Big Bang, all of time and space came into existence, whatever caused the Big Bang cannot be part of time and space. A universe is everything within time and space, including time and space. So whatever caused the universe has to transcend time and space. Therefore, I'm offering premise 2 of my argument. If the universe began to exist, which science tells us, then the universe has a transcendent cause. Why transcendent again? Because it must be beyond time and space. It can't be part of time and space and create itself. So therefore, it follows necessarily from that, the universe has a transcendent cause. But what are our options for a transcendent cause? Well, the cause must itself be uncaused, beginningless, spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. That is what it has to be a transcendent cause. We only have two options that fit this category. The first is any abstract item, anything abstract like a number. The second would be an unembodied mind. Now let's look at the first one. Abstract items don't cause anything. They are spaceless and timeless, but the number 7, for instance, causes nothing. So it can't possibly be what brought the universe into existence. So therefore, the best explanation would be an unembodied mind. Theists have always claimed that God is an unembodied mind. If you are going to defeat this argument, you
he's going to have to show how the universe could come into existence either from an abstract item or some other possibility of causation that's timeless and spaceless. I want to move now to the premise for my second argument, which is called the fine-tuning argument. Now, by fine-tuning, I do not mean designed. Okay, fine-tuning is a neutral term. What we mean by fine-tuning is when we observe our laws of nature, there are a lot of constants that are just put in as givens, constants and quantities. For instance, the strength of gravity just is the strength of gravity. It could be 10% higher, it could be 5% weaker, but it just is that strength. And there are about a dozen or so of these that most cosmologists agree are very fine-tuned. Some people think there's more, but a dozen's a pretty fair amount. And if these are not set at a very precise range, we will not have a life-permitting universe. Now, by life permitting, I want to be very specific here. I don't mean human life permitting. I don't mean biological life permitting. Maybe you can build life out of silicon or some other type of element. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about whether we would have stars, whether we would have chemistry, whether we would have matter. These are what I'm talking about, these constants, these fine-tuning quantities. So I'm going to offer you premise one. The fine-tuning I'm describing is due to one of three things: physical necessity, chance, or design. Now, physical necessity is pretty much ruled out by just about everybody because you can make gravity 50% stronger and our laws of nature will work just fine. You can make the cosmological constant or the nuclear force strength, you could change any of those and our laws of nature will hold just fine. So that's not really defended by anybody. For a long time, chance, number two, was actually what everybody said was the reason. We just got lucky. Woo! If those things weren't set that way, we wouldn't be here to observe them, therefore it must have just gotten lucky. But as we've gotten better at science, I think we found out we're just a little bit too lucky. I want to give you some idea of the scale of the numbers we're talking about. If the universe came into existence 13.7 billion years ago, we can determine that the amount of seconds that has elapsed since then is 10 to the power of 17, okay? That's 1 with 17 zeros behind it. That's approximately how many seconds has elapsed since the universe came into existence. If we ask a physicist, how many particles, subatomic particles, are in the known universe, 20 billion light years across? The answer that is commonly given and estimated is 10 to the power of 80. That's a 1 with 80 zeros behind it. Good luck coming up with whatever name for that number actually is. But, so this is the kind of scale of these numbers we're talking about. They're huge, they're enormous. And I want to look at one in particular today, first from time constraints, which is called the cosmological constant. Now, the cosmological constant is responsible for the expansion of our universe. It's what makes the galaxies fly apart and what makes our universe expanding and keep up the expansion. So you can see here that if it must fall within an extremely narrow range around 0. If it doesn't, the universe will either collapse or expand too rapidly for galaxies and stars to form. So let's look at that number. That's actually supposed to be higher, but 10 to the power of 120. Now, I told you that there's 10 to the power of 80 subatomic particles in the universe. 10 to the power of 81 is 10 times 10 to the power of 80. 10 to the power of 82 is 10 times the power of 81. This number makes the number of subatomic particles in the universe look like chicken feed. That is an enormous number. That is a 1 with 120 zeros behind it. Now, let me quote Leonard Susskind, Stanford physics professor, talking about this. He says, "Nobody thinks that is accidental. That is not a reasonable idea, that something is tuned to 120 decimal places just by accident." So I offer premise 2. It is not due to physical necessity or chance. Okay? Secular physicists agree. Chance is not a live option. Physical necessity is not a good option. Therefore, it follows necessarily from that premise that it is due to design. Now, how do people like Susskind and others get around this conclusion? Well, they postulate that there must be a multiverse. There must be a ton of other universes with different physical laws and different constants, and we just happen to be in the one that's good for us. Really? There's potentially an infinite number of universes just like ours? I would like to see some evidence for this incredible claim. But until there is some, we're stuck with this syllogism, which is design is the best explanation for this incredible fine-tuning. The last argument I want to present today is the moral argument. And I want to say right up front, I am not saying that you have to believe in God to be moral. That's the last thing I'm saying. Matter of fact, go ahead and assume atheism might be true. It won't affect my last argument. Okay? There are a lot of atheists that live much more moral lives than theists. So that is not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is that in our moral experience, we find that some things are truly objectively wrong. When somebody walks into a school and shoots up innocent little boys and girls and teachers, I don't need a syllogism to show you that's wrong. You all know it. It's horrendous. It's objectively evil. I don't mean like, oh, it's okay for him to do it and not okay for me to do it in a subjective sense. I mean, that's wrong for everyone. Let me give you another thing when I'm talking about objective. Let's assume Hitler won World War II. And after he won World War II, he exterminated every single person or brainwashed every single person on the planet until they all believed that he was right. But you know what? We all still know Hitler was wrong. So objective moral values and duties hold whether anyone believes in them or not. Okay? That's what I'm talking about. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. So this is not really that controversial. There are a lot of atheist philosophers who feel the same way. Let me quote Michael Roos from Florida State. The position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality because such awareness is of biological worth. Let me skip to the end to save some time here. Any deeper meaning is illusory. On a naturalistic view, it just doesn't seem any reason for there to be an objective moral values and duties. Moral values and duties are just products of socio-biological behavior and conditioning. No more than like hands and feet or hair. So what would be morally binding about a herd morality? We can all watch a troop of baboons use cooperative or self-sacrificing or even altruistic behavior, and are we just primate cousins of these baboons? What about that makes objective morality any more binding? You know, rape is taboo in our society because it's not good for humans, what we do here in society, but that kind of behavior goes on all the time in the animal kingdom. What is it that makes it objectively wrong here? The rapist who chooses to just decide not to go along with the herd morality isn't doing anything more than really just acting unfashionably. He's not doing anything objectively wrong. But you know what? We all know that's not true. Deep down inside, we know some things are truly wrong. So premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist. We know this. We know this just as clearly as we know 2 + 2 = 4, or that there's an outside world, or that the past wasn't created 5 minutes ago and all our memories are preloaded. It's just as obvious that that's the case. And if we don't think there are moral values and duties, we can't speak out against things like racism or child abuse or things we know that are objectively wrong. Therefore, it follows from that God exists. Some people think the presence of evil disproves the existence of God. But I think the exact opposite is true. Real evil exists. It's here. You know it. And the only way that could be possible, for it to be objectively wrong evil, is if God exists. I presented 3 arguments today. A cosmological argument, a design argument, and a moral argument. Unless we can find something from the other side to put in place of these arguments, I think the most reasonable thing to believe is that God exists. Thank you.
Hey, right on.
All right. All the time. All right. Okay, Matt, are you up next?
Okay, so we have a relatively simple PowerPoint. Who's running the computer?
I can take it up there.
Okay, I'm trying out this microphone. Can you hear me on this?
Yes.
Is this working?
Yeah, I figured
I prefer not to have to hold something.
Hey, Joe, understand a little bit of that. Yeah. Am I good for that? Thank you,
Wait,
Ryan. It's my light. No, these
Turn the
blocks
camera.
are reflecting.
You're going to bring it from the time.
Okay. Alrighty, now did you two collaborate on this, or you're just doing blindly from, you didn't know what the other was gonna say?
So, well, before you start that timer, let's just say the way this works is they just gave a positive case, and then we're going to give our case as well, and we're not going to be directly responding to what they just said until the next round. So after we talk, then they're going to talk for 10 minutes about what we said, and then we'll talk for 10 minutes about what they said. So this presentation isn't directly going to be related to what he said, though there are obviously going to be some parallels and some intersections. So,
All right, you're on.
okay. So the first thing that we wanted to talk about is just to get clear on what it actually means for a belief to be reasonable, because that's a pretty important thing when the topic of the debate is, is belief in God more reasonable than non-belief? So just to run through this relatively quickly, the first thing is that it has to be, ideally, it would be testable and specific. So what that means is that a belief, it has a couple of things, predicts incompatible and compatible observations. So that if I tell you I've got a car outside, that's testable. You could go and you could look, and you kind of have an idea of what I mean, right? So that's one thing. The next thing is that there's strong supporting arguments, right? And so that's what Larry was just trying to do. That's what we're going to try and do as well. And the point of this, again, is just to give you an idea of how we're evaluating, whether or not belief in God is reasonable or not. The second one is strong supporting evidence. So arguments are a little bit different than evidence, right? So Larry gave a lot of arguments with syllogisms moving from one point to the next. That's a supporting argument. Supporting evidence would be sort of what he was talking about with the cosmological constant, that kind of thing. Lack of falsifying evidence, right? So this is evidence that you shouldn't see if the theory is true, right? So if I tell you I don't have a car, you shouldn't see me driving a car, and maybe I'm borrowing the car, right? But if you see me driving one, it would give you cause for question. Incorporates a wide array of relevant evidence, right? This is a good thing for a reasonable belief to have as well. So, we don't want a situation where we're just picking out a few things, like, hey, the universe looks fine-tuned, but then leaving out lots of other things. Not accusing you of that, you've got a pretty wide array. And then consistent with other well-supported beliefs. So this is a good thing too, right? When we find out something new and we find out, okay, this fits with other stuff that I've got good reason to believe. And then the last one is it explains the relevant facts. So there are way too many relevant facts to go into all of them, right? But we've got a big universe. It's huge, and it's really old, and it's full of all sorts of strange stuff. It's full of black holes and stars and all the sorts of things he was talking about. But here on Earth, we've got lots of good things like love, and we've got things that we really enjoy, but then we've got lots of terrible things like genocides and hatred and crime, all this sort of stuff. So we want an explanation that explains all of the relevant facts, right? Again, not one that's just focusing on a few little things about the world. All right. So to that end, we're going to go through a couple of arguments sort of in support of humanism, but more an underlying theory below humanism called naturalism, right? So naturalism is opposed to supernaturalism. But since this debate is specifically about God, we're going to go into details about God too, not just naturalism, supernaturalism. So the first one, I'm just going to give you a kind of overview, and then Virge and I are going to go back and forth on a few things, is that God is silent. We think, okay, this is a little bit weird. He could really clear up a lot of confusion, end a lot of misery, a lot of conflict if he would just say a few words, but he doesn't. God doesn't act. So this is the sort of issue of the problem of evil and the idea that the universe is morally inconsistent with an omnibenevolent God. And that omnibenevolent just means all good, right? Perfect, morally perfect. This is another one that's interesting, how throughout history you've had the consistent replacement of supernatural explanations with natural explanations. You pick any point in time, go back a couple thousand years, and you trace back to the present, and you find supernatural explanations that have been replaced by natural explanations, and as soon as that replacement happened, that area of inquiry has been totally revolutionized, and we've had new powers, new abilities to understand, predict, and control. All right, the next one is that the universe is coarsely tuned. It's not finely tuned. And this is gonna run sort of oblique or orthogonal to what Larry was saying, but we'll get into what he said in our rebuttal. And the next one is evolution. So we do take this to be good evidence of metaphysical naturalism or just naturalism. You could kind of make it work with theism, but it's a lot more difficult. Likewise with the fact that we have physical minds, that a lot of our personalities and memory systems and the whole architecture of human characters is based in the brain. It's good evidence for that. And then this fancy sounding phrase that they know I love, ontologically basic mental entities. So you gotta hold that one because I'm gonna tell you what it means, but not till the end. Okay. So I'm gonna pass it over to Virge.
So, hello? All right, there we go.
3 seconds.
All right, he pretty much just explained what we meant by God is silent. So if you expect to a universe where a God actually does exist, where there's one where he created, and for most beliefs, you know, he does interact, you would assume to find evidence of such a being, especially all-knowing and all-powerful, all-good, but we see nothing. Not getting into specifics, but we do have these, books for various religions and things that have dictates from a God, but we don't hear anything from the God itself. We have different factions within these same religions that do opposing views, different dogmas within these religions that are so vastly different that they're basically different religions altogether. But we hear nothing that clears it up, that justifies a belief in one rather than another. So, assuming that there would have been some form of God, we should assume that we would have some form of knowledge of him through contact and interaction.
So just another point on this is that this is a good example of, when we were talking about what makes a belief reasonable, this is a good example. Often the defenses of this are kind of an example of reasoning in reverse, right? That if you assume in advance that there's a God, like assuming we could know that, then you might be able to come up with some sort of plausible sounding story about why we don't hear anything from God, right? You could come up with a story that could be maybe potentially satisfying, but since our observations about the universe are what we have to determine, in order to determine whether or not a God exists, this is something that fits, we think, quite firmly on the side of naturalism. The fact that God is silent is a big problem, because it would be so easy for God to say things, and because throughout a lot of the texts that these religions are based on, which we're not getting into the specifics of any religion, but often the founding documents themselves have God interacting with people very directly. So that's God's silence. All right. The next one is that God doesn't act. So this is basically a way of stating the problem of evil, that we have a morally inconsistent universe. Why would all of these awful, horrific things be sort of standard fare for our universe? Now again, just like with silence, if you assume God exists, you could sort of work back and come up with some sort of explanation for it, but that's a big bullet to bite. Because basically what you're having faith in that case, is that there is some explanation, there is some story that makes sense, such that God would rather not say a few words and clear things up, and prevent all the massive amounts of religious conflict and warfare, all the personal conflict, all the conflict we have in our world right now as a result of differing religions conflicting with each other. God could resolve all of that, but he doesn't. And you have to have faith that there's some reason, there's some story that would make sense of this. And the word for this that you may have heard is theodicy, right? So basically what we're arguing is that the fact that God's silent and the fact that God doesn't act in cases where it would be very easy for him to do so without impinging upon our ability to make decisions or to believe in him, that this makes sense with naturalism, right? It makes sense. If there is no God, then that's why we don't hear from him, right? Because there is no God. But it's a lot more difficult to make this work.
Also, with the God doesn't act thing, you would assume that if there was a God, and most believers do believe that he does act in the world and in their lives, that places of higher religiosity where more people, you would assume more people would be praying for things, would have a higher instance of certain events happening or not happening that benefit them than places where they don't. And we don't see that. We don't have evidence for that either. It's the same even across the board, pretty much 50-50 depending on the situation.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the history of science and the history of knowledge.
All right, we're claiming that a God is a supernatural claim. It's a specific. You have to kind of give it's obviously a supernatural claim in the fact that it's all-powerful, transcends time and space, all-knowing, things like that. But in order to accept that, you also have to provide evidence for the supernatural in and of itself. So what happens is, we're not ruling out the supernatural, just that there is no evidence for it. We're not assuming that it exists because we have evidence showing otherwise. Like we've said, as time goes on, you see less and less things that once were considered supernatural to be now explained. Easy pot shots are, lightning used to come from Zeus. Now we understand it's the static discharge. Because we started understanding that, we can now predict and show and chart different lightning strikes through the technology from studying this. Same with earthquakes and volcanoes, coming from gods, and now we understand seismology and things like that. So what you've got to do is you have to show that something supernatural is possible. And once you've come up with the possibility, you then have to show how plausible that the supernatural was the cause. Once you come up with a plausibility, you then have to show how probable it was that the supernatural was the cause of this. And once we've agreed on the probability of it, then you have to show the likelihood that it was the supernatural explanation and not something that just occurs like a natural phenomenon.
And one other way to think about this is that, like we talked about at the beginning with what makes a belief reasonable, is that a lot of supernatural beliefs aren't specific and testable, right? So you have a belief about something, but it doesn't actually come with predictions about what should and shouldn't happen in the universe, or no incompatible and compatible experiences or observations. So science, like understanding science as the idea of model building, you build a model about how you think something works, and you derive predictions from that, and you go and you test it, and you see if those are true. And then you revise the theory or you reject the theory based on those tests. And then evidence sharing and peer review, these are other aspects of science. Everywhere science has stepped in, everywhere this kind of build a model and then test it to see if it actually works, everywhere that's stepped in, it's totally revolutionized that area of inquiry. And in a very short period of time, a couple of 100 years, we have literally reshaped the world such that the environment that we exist in now, you look around and there's nothing that hasn't been touched by this method of inquiry. But it's important, as Virge was saying, that it's not an assumption. It's not like you rule out supernaturalism. You just say, okay, sure, there could be things that were supernatural, but we'd see evidence of them. We would, if we looked inside the human brain and all we found was a cloud or like a light, and there was no complex structure, nothing for, no storage platform, no inference platforms, then yeah, that would be a good example. All right, so we're going to move on to the next one, which is that the universe is coarsely tuned. And basically, we'll go into more detail based on what he was saying, the arguments he was specifically making. But what we wanted to show with this is that this is an example of a supernatural explanation being superseded by a natural one. That what we see in the universe is a better fit for naturalism, given the massive scale of the universe, and given that, I think the way Virge put it was that most things in the universe would kill us just by doing what they do. Right, and so Larry wasn't disagreeing with this. He's saying that, but basically what we're arguing is that the universe does not appear in any way to be designed for human life or for life at all. And that a lot of the things in the universe that do work well, they don't work so well that they don't have lots of bad stuff happen occasionally. Galaxies colliding. We also think about just on the Earth, like the wind. The wind is very useful, but then it turns into hurricanes. Also with rain, with heat. There's all sorts of things like this. We won't go into this with too much detail, but one distinction we wanted to make is between intentional design, which is what Larry was talking about, and incidental design. And these are two very different concepts. So intentional design it always involves some sort of simplicity, right? You don't have unnecessary parts. You have something that's created for a purpose to accomplish a specific goal. Incidental design, like something that you get by way of an unintended natural process, And you could think about the ways in which cities form is very different. But we're gonna speed through a couple other things.
Evolution actually works in with the intentional design and incidental design. Like he was talking about, with intentional design, you see simplicity. There are no extra parts. So when it comes to like humans, for example, we have tonsils and an appendix and things like this that we don't actually need. So that would show not so much intentional design, but as incidental, which, natural process of evolution just kind of, we end up not, getting rid of them.
And in incidental design, every iteration of the thing has to be viable. So you get a very particular kind of pattern of development when you look at incidental design. And so, okay, just a few more things because we have to speed through. Physical minds. So this fits well with metaphysical naturalism. That, like I said, if we open up the brain and we found just a cloud or a light, that'd be bad news for that theory. And say, okay, clearly there's something going on here that we don't understand. So there's all sorts of evidence of when you damage a certain part of the brain, it damages a certain part of mental functioning. So the last thing I told you I was going to tell you about is that this makes a problem for the idea of God as a first cause, is that given that brains and minds are the most complex thing that we've ever come across, by positing them at the very beginning of the universe to explain like very simple things, you're making the problem much, much, much worse.
You're explaining a complex thing with an even more complex thing.
Yep. So this is basically the rundown of the argument, and then we'll talk more about it in round 2.
All right.
So many times.
If I may interject a little bit, it seems like we almost need to have a definition of God here. It seems that your argument boiled down to just a creative force, other than the moral argument.
We weren't arguing for just God in general, not specific.
Yeah. As a lot of the arguments here, we're talking about kind of the Christianish, omniscient and omnipotent.
No, okay, this is-
However,
So-
we did agree that
Right,
we
I'll-
argue theism.
I'll read you Larry's definition. So Larry and I were going back and forth about this
We're gonna
because
do it back.
we wanted to get clear on this. Larry said, I think you'd be safe. I think you'd be safe. This is what we'd be safe assuming, that God being supreme, eternal, having all the omnis, which, correct me if I'm wrong, would be omnipotence, all powerful, omniscience, all knowing, omnibenevolent, all good, omnipresent, maybe. So having all the omnis, being the source of morality, indestructible. So supreme and eternal, having all the omnis, source of morality, indestructible. That's the idea of God we're arguing. We're not talking specifically about the Christian God, though obviously that fits with Christianity.
Okay. 15 minutes here? 10, okay. Great. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I want to start off.
Are we done with the computer, or what? What do you think? Okay.
I say that now.
Go.
Okay. Thank you. I'll first reiterate what Larry stated in his opening comments. He made 3 arguments. One was the cosmological argument that the universe came into existence. If the universe came into existence, it must have been from a transcendent being. The universe came into existence, therefore there is a transcendent being, or a being that transcends the universe. The second argument was the fine-tuning argument, which we'll deal with shortly, since Matt did indirectly address it with his coarsely tuned argument. And third was the moral argument, which I don't think they actually hit. Maybe they'll get it in their rebuttal time. So let's look at what they did actually bring up. They brought up the argument from God's silence, often referred to as the hiddenness of God. And I believe it was Virge pointed out that many theists actually do believe that God is not silent, that he is active in this world. And that's something I believe. I don't know if there's a burden of proof here one way or the other. I think the arguments that Larry brought forth show that there is a God that, at least would at least get to a deist point of view, that is active in this world. We could go to different religions, which we're not going to today, to show he's active every day, various ways. But I don't see that as a definite defeater to anything. Matt brought up the problem of evil. It sounded like he went for what would be known as the the evidential problem of evil, sometimes referred to as the probabilistic problem of evil. And what that says is, if God exists, it's just a summary. If God exists, gratuitous evil does not exist. Gratuitous evil does exist, therefore it's highly unlikely that God exists. So it would seem that there's an awful lot of evil and suffering in this world, but can we determine that it's actually gratuitous? And if there's an infinite God that exists, it's tough to prove that finite evil and suffering is gratuitous. We see and experience events of suffering in this life that as time goes on, the severity of the suffering seems to diminish. For example, 2 years ago, my father was rushed to the emergency room. He was in severe pain. When I got there, he described having chest pains, the worst pain he had ever experienced. They were giving him something that was stronger than morphine, and it wasn't helping. He continued in that pain until the next day when they did surgery. But by that time, his body had gone through such trauma, his body forgot how to breathe on its own. He ended up being in the hospital for a month to learn how to breathe. He was in intensive care most of that time. Today, 2 years have gone by. That episode in his life has little to no effect on him at all. He's just fine, no problems. But it's possible, if it's even possible, that after going through an event like this, someone might appreciate life and their fellow man more than previously. This could result in a greater good. It may or may not be witnessed until generations later. Given this possibility, it's not possible for finite beings like us to declare that gratuitous evil exists. And in fact, Matt, I think, kind of referred to this. Given the arguments for the existence of God that Larry gave, if we accept those, we can actually reverse this problem of evil to be this. 1, if God exists, gratuitous evil does not exist. 2, if God exists. So 3, therefore, gratuitous evil does not exist. So I don't see the problem of evil being a defeater, although it is probably the toughest argument that a theist would have to deal with. They brought up the history of science and how things have, claims of God throughout time have been replaced. One thing Matt brought up is science has to be testable. And that is true to some respect, but lots of sciences aren't testable. The historical sciences, for the most part, aren't testable. We cannot, from cosmology, we can't go test the beginning of the universe. It was a one-time event. There's no way we can go back there. We can do small tests and infer things back and do hypothesis and try those things out, but there's no way to do that. What we do instead is an inference to the best explanation, and that's what we have here. Where Larry went down in cosmology, science is saying that the universe had a beginning. Well, if this universe had a beginning, all space, time, and matter came into existence at that beginning. Well, what does that infer? It infers that a non-spatial, timeless, non-material cause caused this universe to come into existence. So we're inferring to the best explanation there. Same thing with the fine-tuning argument. We showed that necessity couldn't be the answer, because those values were in place when the universe came into existence. They're not affected by the physical laws of the universe. They were just preloaded out there. So necessity is not a good answer. The chance is highly unlikely. Larry brought up the cosmological constant. Let me bring up another one, the entropy level in the initial universe. Sir Roger Penrose, he worked with Stephen Hawking on the singularity theorems. He has calculated that the precision of the initial entropy of the universe had to be precise to 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. That dwarfs even the cosmological constant. So if you're going to say that chance is a better explanation, you would never bet on the Powerball or anything if those were the odds, because those odds are pretty much zero. Not only does that have to be that precision, at the same time the cosmological constant has to be at its precision. And there's about 30 or so that scientists agree on these fine-tuned constants. On the coarsely tuned argument, well, they said there's unnecessary parts, talking about incidental design. You've got to assume a purpose in there. If they're saying there's unnecessary parts, well, you have to know what the purpose was to start with. So I need to know what purpose are we presupposing there. Because you can't say something is extra or bad design or something along that line unless you know what the design was, what its purpose was in the first place. I want to bring up an argument. We talked about evolution. I know Matt likes evolution, and evolution is not contradictory to theism necessarily. But in the past, I'd say 50 years or so, we've been amazed by the scientific findings on the microscopic level. Down at the cell, we have the discoveries of DNA. And here's what Richard Dawkins says about DNA and us. We are machines built by DNA whose purpose is to make more copies of the same DNA. Flowers are for the same thing as everything else in the living kingdoms. We're spreading copy-me programs about written in DNA language. Now DNA, it's been said, is like written sentences, computer code, or blueprints. Evolution requires a mechanism of self-replication. Scientists have discovered that in the cell, DNA holds this information necessary to accomplish this self-replication. Our human experiences show that information of this sort, which we would call specified and functional or functional, is always the result of intelligent conscious activity. When we see the specified information, we find intelligent conscious activity behind it. Therefore, the information in DNA is the result of intelligent conscious activity. So dilemma one for the naturalists: no natural form of intelligent consciousness existed when the first cells needed to be replicated for evolution to take place. Natural forms of intelligent consciousness needed many steps of evolution to occur before they could exist, but these same steps of evolution could not take place until the information necessary for replication was in the cell. But that would require the intelligent consciousness to already exist. Dilemma two for the naturalist: DNA is like a set of blueprints describing how objects, like the proteins, are to be constructed. But blueprints aren't capable of constructing anything. That requires a mechanism to interpret the blueprints and tools to carry out the plan. Where would the mechanism and tools come from if it is a requirement for evolution to occur? It couldn't be the result of evolution, because evolution could not occur without it. It would require that the cell be preloaded with information, mechanisms, and tools that we know from our experiences to be the result of intelligent conscious activity. But there was no natural form of this before evolution took place. Conclusion: the best explanation, once again we're referring to the best explanation, is that a non-natural form of intelligence preloaded the cell. And this is before a physical mind could possibly exist. So this would be evidence for an unembodied mind. Quickly, on an unembodied mind, I know Matt's going to say it could not exist. I want to point out that you have to separate between conscious states and brain states. Brain states are physical. You can measure them. You can detect them. Conscious states are things like sensations, thoughts, beliefs, desires, and free acts. We can quickly see that they are not physical. They don't have geometric properties. Beliefs and thoughts can be true or false. Physical states, on the other hand, have geometric properties and can be neither true nor false. They just are. And because of that, I believe it's more reasonable to believe in God than not believe. Thank you.
Shall we begin?
Yes.
Great, okay. So Larry first started talking about the cosmological argument, how the idea that the universe began to exist, right? And that's this question: how do we get something from nothing? The first and most basic response I have to this is what I mentioned in our opening, is that by introducing a mind, you make the problem 1,000 times worse, at least, probably a lot more than that. And the reason for that is that, like I said, minds are the most complex thing that we've ever seen. And all of the evidence we have of how minds function is that they require some sort of substrate. So think about the things that are involved in the mind. You have to have some sort of memory system, right? Some way to remember what's happened. You have to have some sort of processes of inference, the ability to make a decision, the ability to represent what's happening in some other place other than yourself and also in yourself, to make a decision about what to do as a result of that. These sort of processes, the best evidence that we have is that they took a very, very, very long time to come around. And like Bill was saying, he said it took a number of, in order to get natural forms of consciousness, which I argue is all that there are, it took a long time for that to happen. Now this is very different than saying, like he brought up the distinction between brain states and mind states. So states of consciousness and states of the brain. Those are important distinctions. But just like you can, let's say you have a PowerPoint presentation and you put it in the cloud, right? So that's stored on a server somewhere, on a spinning platter on a hard drive. And then you put it on a flash drive, a little flash disk, right? That's electricity stored as transistors, right? Let's say you burn it to a CD, that's grooves on a CD, right? There are a number of different substrates that can hold the same information that are physically entirely different, right? You look at a hard drive, or you look at a CD and you look at a flash drive, the substrate is totally different, but the information is the same. Likewise with conscious states and brain states. So conscious states can be created, can be derived, can be generated from lots of different types of substrates. We think it's probably likely that you could make a silicone brain, right? You could make a brain out of a computer eventually. It doesn't have to be the wetware of the brain. In philosophy of mind, they call this bio-chauvinism, right? The idea that you sort of chauvinistically think that it's just neurons. So the idea, or my response to this is that yes, conscious states and brain states are different, but you always have to have a substrate. There has to be some place where information is being stored and processed. And that place is incredibly, incredibly complicated. So to say that the universe began to exist, we're trying to explain the very beginning, right? The most, an extremely simple thing before there's all this complexity. How do we explain that? If we posit a mind, we're making the problem worse for ourselves. And we also then have to just push the question back further of, well, where did that mind come from? And that's why I said it's a much more difficult option. The idea that, so the argument that Larry was prosecuting, saying it has to be an abstract item or an unembodied mind, I just reject that it has to be one of those. I think it could be an uncaused, maybe it's an uncaused being, right? Maybe it's an uncaused event. Basically right now we just don't know. And what we don't want to do is posit an answer that's a curiosity stopper as opposed to an expectation controller, right? An expectation controller is a belief that when you have it, it makes predictions about what you should and what you shouldn't see, right? The reason why when we replace supernatural explanations with natural explanations, the reason why this works so well is because we're creating beliefs that aren't curiosity stoppers where you just think, oh, God did it, or oh, Bill did it, or oh, Larry did it, or Matt did it, whatever, and we figure out exactly why, and we can make predictions about it. So this idea that, okay, it began from nothing, and we don't, this is just a space where we don't know exactly how it happened. And I'm comfortable saying that maybe it needed to be something, a transcendent cause that's timeless and all this sort of stuff you're talking about, or maybe we just don't understand it yet, right? So what I'm not willing to do is accept a God of the Gaps argument that says, well, listen, we don't understand this, so it must be God, because that introduces all these other problems. All right, the second thing is the fine-tuning argument. So the cosmological constants, and you mentioned something else in your second presentation, just these numbers that are incredibly unlikely, right? That they have to be tuned out to a very, very long distance. I think most people who are informed about this agree that there's a lot of stuff at play here that seems really unlikely. But I think Larry dismissed the multiverse and did so in an interesting way by saying that he would like to see some evidence. I would like to see some evidence of the mind. I think that there isn't any evidence of a supernatural mind. I don't think there's, and I think that because of the way the universe looks, because of the way natural selection looks, because of the appearances of the universe, they appear as though they're not designed intentionally for the purposes of human life. That these are good reasons to think that maybe something like a multiverse is plausible, right? That there's some sort of process whereby universes are born. And if that's the case, then it makes sense that we would be in one where we're past possible. This is called the anthropic principle, right? Yeah. So the anthropic principle is basically like, if there are other universes where stars can't form, chemistry can't form, and the whole thing can't get off the ground, then you'd never have beings, it's not possible for beings to evolve in that universe capable of having this discussion. So we would always be in a universe where that's possible. Now, if the multiverse turned out not to be true, and if it turned out that this is the only universe, I don't know how we could find that out to be sure. But if we had good reason to think that, then this argument would be stronger. The fine-tuning argument would be stronger. But I think it would be stronger in the position, moving us towards something that would make us think, okay, maybe our universe was created, but not for the purposes of human life or other things like this. Maybe it's created by, maybe we're a simulation in a computer. You know, I mean, this is something that physicists actually talk about. Maybe we're a simulation on some other computer or something like this. But given the way that the universe looks, and given how inhospitable the universe is to human life, that something like 4%, I think 1 particle out of 1 billion in the universe is actually involved in complex structures like galaxies. Right? Most of the matter in the universe is just random, just floating around, and it doesn't even bring in dark matter. So we've got a universe that's just it's not fine-tuned for any specific purposes other than maybe the production of black holes. All right, I want to get into the moral argument in just a minute. Maybe I'll just get into it this minute. So what Larry did was appeal to your intuitions, your moral intuitions. Like, you just know that certain things are wrong. You just know. But if you look through the actual history of the beliefs, the moral beliefs people had, they've changed quite dramatically. And people used to just know that women were inferior to men, and other races were inferior to the white European, and that they just knew that slavery was condoned by God and a natural part. Right? People uttered these things with the same conviction, just like people in today's world, often in Muslim cultures, in various fundamentalist cultures and subcultures around the world, will argue for things with absolute conviction and say, you just know it's wrong. You just know that homosexuality is wrong in your heart, in your soul. But all it's doing is just appealing to your moral intuitions. I think that this is a complex thing to talk about, but in fact, I think that if God exists, everything is permissible. Because think about this. If we're attributing omnibenevolence, moral perfection, perfect goodness, right, to a being, and a lot of people who do this take the various holy books as their guide for this, then basically we're allowing that things like, and even if we just look at the world and the way the world was created, we're allowing that things like genocide and things like all of the massive, terrible sufferings, and I think contrary to what Bill was saying, sure, there are sufferings that we go through that once they're over, and we're fine. But then there are others that once it happens to you, it scars you forever, and that you never get over. And I mean, the prevalence of things like PTSD is really a testament to this, that people go through such horrific experiences that they're never okay, and they're never able to flourish or be happy. That if God exists, then that's what God wanted, right? And there's a philosopher in the 19th century who talked about the quote-unquote teleological suspension of the ethical, which is a fancy way of saying God can basically suspend ethics and say, you know what, Abraham, kill your son, right? That's okay now. So this idea that morality is objective if God exists is really just a claim that the only thing that's objective is that God sets punishments that you can't escape, right? If God exists, then that would be true, right? And if he cared about what we wanted to do. But in the naturalistic sense of morality and ethics, basically what we're talking about is the how to interact with each other, how to get along, how best to take each other's interests into account, and why we should do that, right? There are lots of naturalistic, perfectly normal, humanistic reasons for doing that, and the answers to those are not going to be arbitrary, because the conditions of our flourishing are not arbitrary. So basically, I've been talking about the cosmological argument, and I said that doesn't work to show that God exists, because by introducing a mind, an unembodied mind, you make it much worse for yourself. And the fine-tuning argument doesn't fit because the universe actually does not appear to be in any way hospitable to human life or show any of the signs of intentional design. And then we talked about the moral argument.
So now we have.
Can we turn the projector
Yeah,
down?
yeah, let's
Turn the lights on.
Put the lights on.
And turn the lights on. So you see the thing? Is it good? All right, so now we have 5 minutes of closing arguments. So, yeah. There we go. Now you see the man behind us. Perfect. And it solves all the issues over there. All right.
Today I gave 3 arguments, and I presented them all in a syllogism format. all the syllogisms were sound. Reasonable, or the definition here, means agreeable to sound reason or judgment, all right? If you're going to remain reasonable or rational, I mean, you either have to accept the conclusion of the syllogism, or you have to deny a premise. That is logic 101. You can't just say, I don't know, I don't accept anything. That is the definition of unreasonable. So you either have to get out of the syllogism by denying a premise, or you have to accept the conclusion. You don't have a third option. That's reason 101, that's logic 101. So when Matt says, I'm just good with not knowing what that is, despite a very logical, a sound syllogism that follows, that is anti-reason. You can't do that. You either have to accept it or get out of the syllogism. He says that a mind is more complicated than the creation. Minds are simple. What parts are there to a mind? Is your will separable from your beliefs? No, a mind is a simple, unified entity. His postulation that they're complicated is just an assertion. Minds are simple entities, the very most simple thing. Then, Matt's opening statement was, what makes a belief reasonable? His first one, testable and specific. Then, when it came to the multiverse generator, he was saying he could believe in a multiverse, although we really have no way to test for it. So he's going back on his own first premise, which was, for something to be reasonable, it needs to be testable and specific. We have a multiverse, which he's okay with, which he has no testing for and no proof for. What I provided was a syllogism every time that it's either deniable or unescapable. You either have to deny something or accept the conclusion. At the end there, he also said, he's talking about moral beliefs and how they change through time. Back, I think he said at one point it was okay for women to be treated inferiorly. That's great, but that's an epistemological question. He's saying we have come to know now that it's not right to treat women this way. How we come to know that was not my argument at all. My argument was in no way epistemological. It was ontological. I'm saying there's no foundation for that belief if God does not exist. And that's a big difference than saying, well, now we know differently. Well, of course we know differently. And if we want to argue how we come to know different moral values and duties, that's a great topic, because I don't have a lock on that. I'm just saying, if there is such a thing as an objectively right action, then God must exist. Then he also said that, God would have, if he was an omnibenevolent God, that, genocide or whatever else he was claiming wouldn't be justified. To claim that you know what reasons something that would be omniscient would have is a ridiculous claim. He could have incredible reasons for allowing anything. We would have no way of knowing that. And I think that's just something that you can't make a claim that there's no way that if God exists, that this would be allowed to happen. So I think those are some of the things I want to say about that. As far as my overall case and Bill and I's overall case, we really didn't hear anything to refute the cosmological argument other than I don't know, okay, which I've shown is an unreasonable answer to that. As far as the fine-tuning argument goes, these numbers are not in dispute by anybody. It's just a question of why they're there that's in dispute. We weren't offered anything other than a multiverse, okay, which is without any evidence for, and that was part of his original category of what needed to be said to justify something. And finally, I appeal to your rational intuitions. And as he said, yeah, things have changed, but deep down inside, we do know that certain things are objectively right and objectively wrong. And if you're going to say that God does not exist, you don't have a foundation, and really, it will just be the herd morality, sociobiological evolution is what provided our morality. He went down the utilitarian thing with flourishing. That's not a solid foundation.
All right. Thank you very much. And conclusion?
All right, in conclusion, so what I said when we were talking about the multiverse and is not that it's not in principle possible to test it. I think that the multiverse does have the right sort of structure as a theory, because there are in principle things that we could find and things that we couldn't find, things that would be different and not different, and we're working on that right now, right? So it has the right kind of structure as a theory, and basically what I was saying is that at this point we don't know. So that's very different than the claim that you were trying to make, saying that I don't think it isn't testable or that it isn't specific. It is. It's just we're working on figuring out ways to test it. And the history of science, especially in the 20th century, is replete with examples of very creative experiments that people came up with ways to test things that people in the past thought, we'll never be able to test that, we'll never know. And so I think there's good reason to think that we will be able to test it at some point. All right, so the idea of the cosmological argument and the idea of that I wasn't being reasonable, that you either have to accept the premise or reject the conclusion. Basically what I was saying is that I rejected the way you set it up, that it's not an abstract item or an unembodied mind. It could also be an uncaused cause, or a kind of cause that we don't understand, or it could be a sort of situation that is right now beyond our understanding. It's not necessarily one or the other of either an abstract item or an unembodied mind. And by saying that, I don't think that I've jumped off the train of reason. Basically, what I'm saying is that I am rejecting one of your premises and the way that you set that up. That it seems to us, yes, that something can't come from nothing, and it seems to us that all things have to have a cause. And okay, those sort of I'm willing to consider those sort of possibilities. But I don't think that deductively you can get from one to the other is such that I'm forced to accept the conclusion because I reject the way you set that up. I reject the premise that it has to be one of those two things. Okay, so I also categorically reject the idea that minds are simple. And the idea that complex minds is just an assertion. It's not an assertion. It's actually based on all the evidence that we do have about how the minds that we know actually work. So the idea that minds can be simple is actually an assertion that's free of any evidence other than the introspective experience that, okay, I feel like I have a will and I'm moving towards an object and I want to do something and I have my beliefs. But all the evidence in terms of how the brain actually works is that you can damage very particular parts of the brain, and when you damage those, it's not just a sort of generalized damage. You can remove very specific aspects of brain function, such that you can damage your ability to feel complex emotions like shame, but not simple emotions like fear. And when you do that, people become very bad at making decisions about how to move through life. So I think all the evidence that we have about real minds that we actually have experienced supports the idea that minds are in fact quite complex. And even if you can't consciously experience the difference, that doesn't change anything. That there are all sorts of parts of the brain that are totally inaccessible. You're not feeling neurotransmitters moving around. You're not feeling your inference systems. You're not feeling your brain taking in massive amounts of information and then shortening it out to create a sort of representation of what you're looking at that's much simpler. So, all right, moral beliefs. Larry, again, he just appealed to your moral intuitions. Basically, I think that the idea that without God, nothing is objective, I think that's incorrect. But I do think that morality is different than what we thought it was like under various sorts of religious conceptions. The idea of morality under religious conceptions is that it's something that you can never get out of. It's totally binding. It's a sort of coercive, you must do this. But it's only coercive because there's a big enforcer in the sky that says if you don't, then I'm going to force you to to go to this terrible place and burn, or I've got this great thing.
With morality coming from God, you've either got morality is whatever God dictates to be good or bad, or it's beyond God itself, and then God's just a messenger. So there's no need for God in that equation anyway.
Right, I mean, if morality comes just from God, then it's ultimately just arbitrary. Because you can ask, okay, why should we love each other? Well, because, I want you to. Why do you want me to? Because it brings me glory. Okay, why does it bring you glory? Well, because I decided that it would bring me glory. Because I'm in control of, all these moral things. Why did you decide that it would bring you glory? I don't know. It seemed better than than having you lifting this cup bring me glory. Well, on what basis are you making these decisions? So part of the argument is that ultimately these sort of moral things are going to be based on the justifications that we have to make to each other basically we're telling each other the reasons we have to do things, and those reasons are not totally arbitrary because they're based on facts about reality. And we can talk more in the Q&A about that.
All right.
So are we now open to questions?
Yeah.
I'm sure there must be a few. I think Andrew was first there.
To stay on,
Yeah, stand and project. Oh, wow.
to stay on the morality subject, it seems that Larry's argument that we all know right from wrong, and there's objectively right and objectively wrong. I think that from a humanist perspective, I think that that's because we can figure out what damages humans, that genocide and Hitler is bad for humanity, and what's good for humans, like the doctor that finds a cure for cancer, that's a good thing. And if God tells us those things, then we think he's good, but God could decide that, you know, all Jews should die, and then, you know, that's his morality. So I see the fact that we see morality as objective and true, and everybody would know that as the evidence for that morality comes from human sources, not from divine sources. How do you refute that idea?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess your question is, I'm trying to get, what is your actual question? If you wouldn't mind, just like what? Give me a question. Or what's there? You just kind of made a statement that you think morality comes from human sources. Are you asking? You kind of said
So the objective good and evil.
Right.
Why does that have to come from a divine source instead of from a human source?
Well, I think that's what we're trying to say. Matt brought like a Euthyphro dilemma where it was like, is morality based in God's, you know, will arbitrarily, or is it based in something outside of himself? The answer to that, Bill and I would both say that we don't think either of those is true. We think if God were to exist, his nature would be the good. So it would be him himself. But to answer your question, what about anything that humans construct would make it objectively binding and true? Why would we have to obey it? That's what I'm saying. And I'm not saying, and I keep wanting to say this, it is not how we come to know it. I don't know how we come to know it. I'm not making that claim. We've obviously gotten that wrong an awful lot, okay, throughout history. It's not at all about how we come to know something. That's called epistemology. I'm arguing that if there really is an ontological, yes, there is an objective, if there has to be a God. Otherwise, you're right, that it's just a human construct from sociobiological evolution. That's my argument.
And do we have time to respond to that?
I still got a minute.
It's okay. Yeah, 2-minute response, 2-minute rebuttal.
You kind of referred to in humanism, you can look at what's going to help humans, human flourishing, I guess would be a way of putting that. And the question then is, what would make it objectively right or wrong for humans to flourish? And that's what we're getting at. If there is no God, if we're just the products of physical processes, nature, physics, and chemistry, and we just happen to come about, what makes it right or wrong? We didn't have to exist. We just happen to exist. We don't have to continue to exist, so saying it is right and wrong really has no value there. We may desire that humans continue to flourish, but that doesn't make it right or wrong.
Okay, so the idea that God's nature is the good, I think that doesn't make any sense ultimately. I think it's just words. The idea, the reason for that is that I think that our idea about morality comes from a combination of our values with physical reality. So that we have certain goals that we're trying to achieve, and given those goals within the natural world, there are certain ways of achieving those goals better than others. So this is where this isn't a matter of ontology, like what Larry's saying. We're not discovering moral facts in the same way that we're not discovering facts about health, right? There aren't health facts floating out in the world that we're discovering, but we are finding out true things about how best to keep ourselves healthy, just like we're discovering true things about how best to interact and get along with each other. Now, the point that they're making, which is true, is that the choice of standards is not totally objective, because we're bringing certain things that are just biological into the question, right? That the fact that we care about other people, the fact that we care about ourselves and our own interests, it's not perfectly objective. It's not. But it's not totally arbitrary either.
It's life preferable to death, pleasure preferable to pain, health preferable to sickness, and it's what the moral parts come in is how we go about doing that without causing what we would not want happen to us to others.
But if you want to explain how you think the God's nature thing works, that his nature is good.
Okay, it's been clarified. The person who has asked the question gets 2 minutes, and then the rebuttal is 1 minute. So, okay. Paul had a question. There's a hand back there, and we'll go that order, and then we'll see. Keep going.
Yes, Morgan. Yeah, I just wanted to point out that Einstein, he described the cosmological constant as one of the biggest blunders in his career, particularly after Hubble discovered the existence of other galaxies that were expanding. And also, physicists assert that entropy in the universe is increasing, not decreasing.
Question is?
So, well, I just want to point that out because that would seem to be the basis of your entire argument. When you went into science and support
So is your question?
your argument.
Bill's a pretty good science guy, so maybe he can address that entropy level.
If you want to rebut what I just said, but that's the. I don't know. I'm disturbed by the fact that religious people ought to stay away from science because it's cherry pick facts that are obsolete.
Oh, you added a lot there, right in that last statement.
Yeah.
Since you don't have a question, let me just ramble for a minute. You're correct. Einstein said that was his biggest blunder. But if you do more research, you find that the cosmological constant has returned. Leonard Susskind, prominent scientist that Larry showed there, talked about the cosmological constant. With the universe expanding, they found that it's necessary to bring the cosmological constant back into the picture. Now, Einstein put it in there just because he thought the universe had to be static, not expanding. But now we know the universe is expanding. But they realized there had to be something in there controlling the speed of the expansion. That's why the cosmological constant is back in there. You brought up the entropy level. Yes, entropy is increasing. It has nothing to do with what we said. We talked about the initial level of entropy in the universe. The second law of thermodynamics just says the entropy level is going to continue to increase. And that's just another argument for why the universe is not eternal. Because if it was eternal by now, the universe would have run out of energy based on the second law of thermodynamics. And your last statement, religious people should stay out of science. Point out that Newton was very religious. He was a Christian, I believe. Galileo, many of the early scientists, John Polkinghorne, a more recent one of the leaders in the findings of quarks, Christian. He's now an Anglican priest, by matter of fact. So that's just without merit with the last statement.
So just very quickly, I think that just to sort of wrap that up, the cosmological constant, the whole idea of all these various aspects of the universe that are extremely specific out to hundreds of thousands of decimal points. It's an extremely interesting question to try and figure out why that is. And I think by just positing that that's evidence of God and we're done, I think that is it halts inquiry. It's a curiosity stopper, like most supernatural explanations end up being. And I think because the reasons that we laid out in terms of the impossibility, basically, of minds as a cause for the universe, ontologically basic mental entities, right? Minds that don't have parts. That I don't think there's reason to think that the fine-tuning of the universe is actually evidence for a creator. And also just as a final coda, what you brought up Newton and Galileo, I hear that a lot, but the trouble is that that was a long time ago. And we know a lot more about the universe now, and that a lot of the founding sort of pioneers of science were religious. But I don't think most religious people today would want to sort of put their stake down with Newton, as he was also into alchemy and all sorts of mysticism, and he was almost like the last great wizard. He was like the beginning of the scientific age and also the last of the great wizards or something like that.
That's why I mentioned Polkinghorne.
That's true.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, there's a question back in the corner. I think there's a microphone there.
Yeah, trying to get it on.
Is that going on?
I'll just talk. It's no big deal. It's not that big of a room. I'd like to get back to the topic of morality. And I do believe in objective morality. And objective morality, I think, is very, very simple. And it's based on one thing. Does an action you take cause suffering, or does it remove suffering, or is it neutral? On the way down here from Spartanburg, I swatted a fly and killed it. I was surprised they could actually kill it. You know, that's rare. Usually you never get a fly, but it was aggravating the three of us, so I was trying to get rid of it. That action, yes, it probably caused a minute amount of suffering to that fly, but it might have caused more suffering if it had distracted me to the point where I had a wreck and got us all killed. That would have been a lot more suffering. So, morality, objective morality, I see it can be based on, okay, is an action you take, does it cause a small amount of suffering versus a lot? Does it stop suffering or make it? Like the instance of like slavery or women being devalued over men. Well, both of those things were based upon religious texts, usually, because it was stated somewhere, somebody had said, this came from God, this person can be enslaved, this woman is not as valuable as a man. But now that 20th, 21st century, we free ourselves more and base things upon, okay, enslaving somebody obviously causes suffering. It doesn't, I cause more suffering to them than the benefit I get from enslaving them. I cause more suffering by raping or holding a woman hostage because she's not as valuable as me, supposedly. So if that's true, that morality is based upon suffering, has not, I'm sorry, I'm finishing, has not
Well, we need a
God
question
calls,
and we need to go
I'm
to
getting there,
somebody.
I'm getting there. Has not God caused suffering, if he exists, by not first informing us all once and for all on what we should do with our lives? And number two, has he not caused suffering by letting us all go to war with each other over what we're supposed to do with our lives? Shouldn't he, if he's moral and if he's good and if he exists, shouldn't he come down right here, right now, and show us all what we should do? The end of the suffering?
All right, so your question is, can't we base objective morality on human suffering? Is that your question? Is that what your
Upon
statement
suffering
is?
in general, even upon, if you have to put a dog down,
Okay.
it's not moral, is it, to shoot a dog just because you want to shoot a dog? It's more moral to shoot the dog or put it down if it's suffering because it got run over.
I'm still trying to get, are you saying that we can, I'm asking for what you want to base objective morality on. You want to base it on suffering in general?
Just an action to, it doesn't even have to be to another human, just whether the action you make causes suffering or alleviates it.
Well, what you're making the statement that suffering is objectively wrong, right? And you're just going to base it on that premise. But when we see, let's take rape, like I brought up in my presentation, that goes on all the time in the animal world. Nobody thinks it's immoral, right? It's just what animals do. You watch a great white shark forcibly copulate with another one, okay? We don't say that's immoral. If we watch a hawk come down and steal a fish from another bird who caught it, we don't go, hey, that's immoral. That's just what happens, okay? That's just nature. And so if we are just biological adaptations, we're related to baboons, and that kind of stuff happens in the animal kingdom, what makes suffering objectively wrong? That's my question back to you. All I'm saying is if God does not exist, then we have no foundation, no ontology to make the claim. That's all. I agree with you. I want to alleviate all the suffering I can, but I'm doing it just because I prefer not to suffer, or I don't prefer something else not to suffer, not that it's objectively wrong. That's the argument.
You still got 30 seconds.
Okay, so basically, you were talking about differences in the animal world and the non-human animal world and the human animal world. So we have a capacity for moral reflection, which basically means that we're able to represent the interests of others in our own minds. and take those interests into account, right? So that's not just a sort of a bias. I mean, that's a relevant difference between the two. And I will say that there are some people who do evaluate the behavior of other animals on moral standards and say, look, this is bad. Wouldn't it be better if this wasn't the way the universe was set up? Wouldn't it be better if the nature wasn't red in tooth and claw? You know, why would, and this sort of wraps back around to being an argument against God, and that why would you create a universe where this is the way things happen, as opposed to an unattended natural process like natural selection? So your question of what makes suffering objectively wrong, I mean, I think that there's a point there to what you're saying. I think the only way that, well, never mind, you just have to guess what I was going to say.
Bad dog, bad dog. Okay, let's see. Let's go with Tom and then Joyce and then...
I haven't heard anybody making the argument for the teleological reason for the universe. That is the universe going toward a goal? And does that mean that there must be a God who's got that goal? You know, Thomas Nagel has just come out with a whole book about the subject of the air. I just wondered if you thought that was reasonable.
You're asking me?
Who?
Yeah, I'll ask you that because I kind of know it.
Okay, so you're asking, is it reasonable to think that there's a goal in the universe?
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think that the best way I can make sense of the universe is that it's aimless. There's no specific goal, no specific purpose in mind, but that within an aimless universe, you have different types of physical arrangements and structures that are better at existing than others. So when you think about hydrogen and helium in the early universe, when we think about other aspects of the early universe, and we're taking things like gravity into account and all this, there's certain things that can happen, and those things that happen, and then, you know, things of matter can fall in a number of different arrangements, and it hits one that's stable, right? And it's stable for a number of different reasons, just having to do with physical constants of the universe and other stuff like that. And so things just happen, and then more things happen, and there's one way a biologist put it was, everything is the way it is because it got to be that way. Right, and so that you have teleological, which is basically a fancy word for goal-based or goal-directed. We have teleological creatures like ourselves that set goals and then try to reach them. And when we design things like cups and laptops, you know, we're engaging in this sort of teleological process. But the universe it's so sparse, and there's so many conflicting things that happen in the universe. Like even within biological creatures, you can think about all the different creatures that are at war with each other. And does the universe, the teleology of the universe, whether it's a god or something else, is it favoring the parasites or is it favoring the creatures that are being parasited upon? And there are enough conflicting goals within the universe, and there aren't any of these signs of intentional design to make me think that there is no teleology. I disagree with Thomas Nagel. I'm familiar with the book you're talking about.
It's one of those things where we evolved the trait to look for purpose and look for patterns and things like that. So it's going to be one of those things where we obviously look and think and hope for, well, there's a purpose for this, and there's a goal to this, because like he said, we are goal-oriented creatures. So we kind of put that onto other things as well, like, you know, the purpose of the universe itself. But there's no evidence otherwise.
But it's useful to find patterns. That's why we have it.
The idea of purpose really wasn't part of the discussion today, because we're just talking about what's more reasonable to believe, and be glad to come back some other time if you guys would invite us, we can debate purpose. As Christians, we do have an idea that there is a purpose in all of this. As far as the fine-tuning argument goes, it's just arguing that the inference to the best explanation is that it was designed. It doesn't say anything about what that purpose is. And as I said earlier, if you want to say it's not a good design, or it's not designed good for humans or something like that, then you have to posit or presuppose a purpose there. And you know, that's not part of this debate today.
Joyce?
Yeah, I want to go.
We definitely do.
Yeah, I want to go back to the subject of morality again. The gentleman in the back here seemed to created something that I've always questioned, and that is when we have to make some very, let's say, painful moral choices. I personally have had situations, moral searcher situations, where I have had to make a painful choice. And I really don't see, I've always done the best I could with it, trying to make the best decision. Trying to resuscitate my husband, for example, when I knew pretty much in the back of my mind that he was dead, I still made the attempt, just in case, to keep him alive. That was one hard moral choice for me. Another one was putting my dog down when he was so seriously ill and in such terrible pain that he couldn't stand it anymore. And I was wondering, how do we handle this? It seems to me it always is, you're hit with the situation and you do the very best you can with it. And I personally admit that I don't think about God in these situations at all.
Yes.
I would like opinions on both sides of this.
Okay, is that directed to, I guess we'll start here.
I'm going to take your question as, how do you know what the objective moral thing is to do is kind of what your question is. And I want to reiterate two things. First of all, that I'm not making the claim that I have a way of knowing what the objective moral thing is. That is an epistemological question, and I keep saying that because it's so important. All throughout history, we have gotten it wrong. We're not good at figuring out what the moral thing is to do a lot of times. But that's not the same thing as saying there's not an objective choice. However, I also want to make one other thing very clear. Objective morality is not absolute morality, meaning that it's always the right choice. For instance, killing someone. You can't just say it's always the wrong choice to kill someone. There may be circumstances where someone's attacking you. You are left without an option. But that's different than objectively the right or wrong choice. I want to make sure that's clear. But your question seems to be to me for how do I know whether it was okay to put the dog down. I had the same choice. It was awful, okay, back a few years ago. This argument that I put forth doesn't make a way for you to know it. I'm just saying that if you believe that some things are truly, objectively wrong, that's an ontological question, and there must be a God. If there's not one, then we don't have a foundation for it. I'm sorry, ethics is illusory, just like Michael Roos said in the quote that I put up there. That's all the argument is. It's not going to tell you how to make the right choice.
Okay, so your question sort of like it points out moral dilemmas, like really tough moral decisions. And I think this actually fits really well with the conception, with the naturalistic sort of secular humanistic conception of ethics, that morality isn't as simple as you have a God that created these sort of consequences to certain behaviors. That say if you do this or you believe this, you go here and this happens. If you do this, believe this, you go here and this happens. Right? Morality is more about recognizing certain features and characteristics of others and of situations, and of giving justifications to yourself and to others for those things that you're doing. So throughout history, I don't think we're tracking some sort of separate moral realm. Basically all we're doing is that we're getting better at thinking through and justifying these claims. And so it's the same situation. A lot of false beliefs made bad decisions. So we fail to recognize certain features and characteristics of women and various other races and lots of other things. So we have the same standards of evaluation as you do in questions of belief. And so basically when you're asking, like, is this a moral thing to do? What you're asking is there good reason to do this? And
it almost strikes me that you were saying that there is objective morality, we just don't know what it is.
When you're ready. I think you get better at discovering it as we go.
We're discovering it as we go? Okay. We have time for one more question. Okay.
Just a question for Larry or Bill. At what age, I should say, the belief in God, when should it come into a person's life? Do they come born with this belief, or do they have to be taught that belief? And why?
My opinion is similar. When you look out into the world, it does seem to be designed. Like things seem to happen for, like your hands seem to be created to grab something. You see that you have trees and plants and things that grow for your food. There are things that seem to lead you towards the idea of, hey, why is this all working together? Now, I'm not making that argument. You asked a question of why would someone come to believe in God? Do they come to believe in God because they were taught it, or do they come to believe in God because they just kind of assume that to start with? And I think that's a question I hear a lot of non-believers say, is that everybody's an atheist until they're taught they're a theist. I hear that a lot. But as I look, I can imagine myself back in Aristotle's time, staring up at the stars, looking around at people, imagining all these things. It's tough to imagine all of this stuff and say, wow, this is just here randomly. Now, none of this was part of my argument today. I'm just answering your question about when does someone come to believe in God? Are they born with it, or do they taught it? And my opinion is an observation, an induction will probably lead you that way. Whether it's true or not is not part of my argument. That's just my opinion as to why someone would start to think there might be a God.
And I think we've got two scenarios or two things to think about there. It's the pragmatic idea of God exists and coming to know God. A child often can look out there and believe that, yes, there is a God out there, or they can be taught either way. Then we go through phases in life where we get more educated and we think, okay, can we justify it? Matt would say, no, you can't justify it. Larry and I would say, yes, you can. Yeah, I don't think you can set an age on it. Everyone's different. There are people at an older age that convert to a theistic belief, and there's people at an older age that fall away from it. There's people at a young age make that commitment and make a commitment to theism and stick to it their whole life. So I don't think you can really put an age on it. I think it's out there for everyone to see, but it really depends on the person.
One of the things that I have noticed about this is that
That's it, you're out of time.
One of the things that I have noticed about it is the earlier age that children are taught, and the more that they are brought into a religious or believing community, the longer that they do stay. Now, you made the point of looking out and going, how can this come by chance? I mean, and there are times where I can understand that. I've found more since I've stopped believing that it's just so much more wondrous. I've had more, I guess you could call them, spiritual life experiences, looking at things and discovering new, scientific things and everything without believing than I ever did when I was a believer. And I think what it is it just, like he said, it does depend on the person. But when it comes to ages and with taught, the younger you are, if you are taught this stuff, the more likely you are to stay in there. Also, the more you learn otherwise, you're more likely to fall away.
Can I have 20 seconds?
Sure.
Oh, sure.
Okay, so I think that religion is a natural phenomenon, and I think that there are good reasons about our human psychology and our cognitive systems and inference systems why you find religion in the forms that it takes in terms of positing unseen agents, why you find it across the world. That's something, if y'all wanted to talk about it afterwards, we could. If anyone wants to continue the conversation, I'm sure we can up here. And the last thing I'll say is that the more alternatives people are aware of, starting at an early age and going into their adolescence and into adulthood, the more they're aware of alternative, various religions and philosophical conceptions of what explains the world, why we're here, and what to do with ourselves, the better.
And we're out of time, so.